All right, welcome back. In this video, we're going to talk about how we can create a muzzle flash whenever we click the left mouse button, so it looks like we're firing the weapon. So we're concerned with spawning a muzzle flash effect. And to do that, we need to know where to spawn that effect. Now, this can be done a number of ways. We're going to add a scene component to our character blueprint for a spawn point for the muzzle flash. So let's talk a little bit about scene components. Now, we've seen that our character's arms mesh and the weapon itself are skeletal mesh components. The skeletal mesh component is a child of the scene component class. The scene component class has properties that the skeletal mesh component inherits. Some of these properties are that the scene component has its own transform. That means it has a location, a rotation, and a scale. Scene components support attachment, so you can attach them to each other. A scene component, however, has no rendering or collision, so you can't have a mesh assigned to a scene component. For a spawn point, we don't really need to see it, so a scene component should work nicely. So let's add a scene component to our character blueprint. So I'm back here in the project. I'm going to open up our FPS character blueprint, and I'll click the viewport so I can see all of the components. Now, I'd like to add a scene component, and I want to have this attached to the weapon. So I'm going to click on Gun, and in the Components panel, click Add, and type Scene and select Scene. Now we have a scene component. I'm going to give this component the name Burst Point, and I can see that its location is right here at the base location of the weapon mesh. Now I'd like to move this up to about the tip of the barrel. Now, I can pause the animations playing on the mesh by selecting Mesh, and in the Details panel, I can type Pause and select Pause Anims. Now my mesh is frozen. Now, clicking back on the Burst Point scene component, I can move it forward, and I see here that I'm looking in local space. I can click that and go into world space, and then I'd be moving relative to world space. I'm going to leave it in component space so I can move it forward relative to its own orientation, which is based on what it's attached to, which is the gun. So if I move it forward in the Y direction, I'm moving it in its own Y direction, which is the same as the gun's Y direction as the scene component is attached to the gun. Now I can move it up a little bit so that it's right here at the tip of the weapon's barrel. And I'm going to move it forward just a bit so it's not exactly at the tip of the weapon. So now we have a scene component. Now I'd like to spawn a muzzle flash at this point, and I want to do that when I click the left mouse button, which means we need an action mapping for the left mouse button to be associated with. So I'm going to compile and save, and then go up to Edit and Project Settings. Now from here in Project Settings, I can scroll down and select Input, where I can see my action and axis mappings. In addition to jump and aim, I want a fire action mapping. So I'm going to click plus and name this new action mapping Fire. And I can click the keyboard keys icon and click again, and now we've assigned the left mouse button. And we should now have an input action Fire node. So let's go back into FPS character in the event graph. And just to the right of our input action aim, I'm going to right click and type input action fire and select that. Now, before we go on and start doing things, I'd like to comment our input action aim by highlighting and hitting C, and I can type aiming. Now we know what's going on there. Now for input action fire, we can prove that this is working by using a print string node. So I can use print string and simply use fire for the text. Now, if I compile and hit play, now if I click, I get fire printed to the screen. It looks like my I is uppercase there, but that's okay. I'm going to delete the print string node because rather than printing text to the screen, we want to spawn a particle system. Now, particle systems are special effects in Unreal Engine. And if we go to our Assets folder and go into Characters and Paragon Lieutenant Bellica and Effects, and from there go into Particles, Bellica, Abilities, Primary Effects, we see some special effects. Now, there are lots of folders in this structure because this effect comes from the Paragon asset Bellica. You can download Bellica from the Epic Games Marketplace for free, as all of the Paragon assets Epic Games has released are free to use in Unreal Engine projects. Now, I have this P Bellica muzzle. If I double-click on it, then Cascade opens, which is the particle system editor. Now, Unreal Engine has two different particle system editors. It has Cascade and it has Niagara. Cascade is the legacy system, and Niagara is the newer system. Now here in Cascade, we can see what this effect looks like, and we see that it's directional. It's pointing to the left in its own x-axis direction. So if we spawn this particle system, we need to spawn it at the correct orientation. I'm going to close out of P Bellica Muzzle and close the Assets folder and go back into Blueprints Character. So I'm here with my FPS character. Now, if you closed it, you can double-click that to open it back up. Now, in FPS Character, in the viewport, I'm going to select Burst Point again, and I see that the burst point has its x-axis pointing to the left, if you're looking from the point of view of the character. That means if we spawn a particle system here at the same rotation as the burst point, it'll go that way. So I'm going to hit E to get the rotation gizmo, and I'm going to turn on snapping for rotation. I can even turn the increment up by, say, 90 degrees, and I can rotate it by 90 degrees. Now, if I hit W to get that translation gizmo, I see that the x-axis is pointing forward in the correct orientation. That is what we want for this particle system once we spawn it. Okay, so I'm done pausing the anims. I'm going to go to the details panel for the mesh and uncheck pause anims so we're animated again. If your character's frozen when you're playtesting, that's one of the things to check. So now that we have a burst point, it's time to start spawning particle systems. Now, spawning particle systems in Unreal Engine in Blueprints is very easy. There's a node called Spawn Emitter at Location. It looks like this, and it takes a number of inputs, some of which are required and some of which are optional. Notice the node has an emitter template, and it can take an input in the blue input pin, or you can select an emitter from the dropdown. That P Bellica Muzzle particle system can be selected here as an emitter. It also takes a location and a rotation, as well as a scale. Now, we want to spawn this particle system at the location of the burst point and with the burst point's rotation. So we can get that burst point. We know how to drag in a component onto the event graph and drag off of it to call functions that belong to that. Now, burst point is a scene component, and scene components have the following functions: get world location, which returns a vector, and get world rotation, which returns a rotator. So we can get these quantities and plug them in to spawn emitter at location. And we want to do all of this once we've clicked the left mouse button, which means we want to hook these up to the input action fire. So that's going to be your challenge. Spawn a muzzle flash at the burst point location with the burst point rotation. You're going to use spawn emitter at location and go ahead and choose the P_Bellica muzzle as the emitter template, and use the burst point for its location and rotation using those get world location and get world rotation nodes. Pause the video and implement this now. All right, so I'm going to go back to the event graph, and from input action fire, I'm going to drag off of pressed and type spawn emitter, and I see spawn emitter at location. I'm going to get that, and I'm going to drag in burst point, holding control so I can get a getter, and from burst point, I can type get world location and get that, and I can drag off again and type get world rotation and select that. Now, get world location can be dragged into location, and get world rotation can be dragged in to rotation. Scale can be left at 1 because we don't want to scale this particle system, and auto destroy can be left checked because once we've spawned the emitter, when it's done playing, it will destroy itself, which is exactly what we want. We don't have to worry about pooling method, and auto activate system can be left checked. That means when we spawn the emitter, it'll be activated automatically. Now for the emitter template, I want to choose a particle system. I'm going to choose P_Bellica muzzle. Now I can compile and hit play, and as I click, I see that I have a muzzle flash. And in fact, this muzzle flash effect spawns a shell that looks like it's glowing from the heat. So that's also really cool. So now we have a muzzle flash. Awesome. So in summary, we added a scene component and attached it to our weapon's skeletal mesh. We oriented it so its x-axis is pointing forward so that once we spawn a particle system, it spawns with the correct rotation. We spawned an emitter using spawn emitter at location, and we chose that P Bellica muzzle particle system. And we hooked all this up to our input action fire so that we get this particle system spawned once we click the left mouse button. Awesome job. I'll see you soon.